just want to start by saying there is a lot of talk about EDI in comms and marketing, isn't there? So we wanted to start by just asking, how many times do you think that EDI has appeared alongside the words communications or marketing in the last year on the web? So what do you think? There should be a poll that has come around now. So yeah, just fill that in and let us know what you think the number is. A couple more seconds to make a decision. Just pick anyone if you can't decide. Okay, so there are actually 480 million references to EDI and comms in the same search term across the world, and 104 million times that has been referenced in the UK alone. So I'm sure that you'll all agree that that is quite a lot of talk. But even though we're going to talk today about inclusive comms, we're going to be talking about putting it into action. I'm Sheri Hall, I'm the comms director at Folk. I'm joined by Clare Thompson, who is transformation lead at Macmillan. Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about some of the challenges organisations face when it comes to putting inclusive comms into practice. We'll talk about the fundamentals of inclusive comms through our 6 principles and why having this sort of baseline knowledge is really important for setting a direction of travel. We'll speak to you about how we worked with Macmillan to help them audit their communications. We'll take you through the findings from that audit and our recommendations. So hopefully you'll learn something about the nature of inclusive comms and also get some ideas for how you can overcome some of the key challenges of putting it into practice. All I will say is feel free to ask questions via the Zoom Q&A function throughout the session, and then we'll aim to answer these at the end. My colleague James, who is sat next to me, will also be helping with some polling questions throughout. So please just remember to engage with those. And then if anyone wants to speak to us in more detail about some of the challenges that you're facing in this space, we are actually offering a free workshop to anyone attending this session where we can just chat through your issues, bounce around ideas. So just drop me a note on LinkedIn or email hello@folkgroup.com and we'll get something set up. So for those of you who haven't heard of us, Folk is a creative and strategic comms agency, and we have a fairly unique specialism in that one of the many, many things that we do is inclusive comms. There actually aren't very many agencies who do have a specialty in this. One of our newer clients told us that while she found it quite easy to find an EDI agency, it was quite difficult to find one that was comms and marketing led. We do all manner of things from social media management and strategy right the way through to full-blown creative campaigns. Some of our more inclusion-focused projects have included working with the Welsh Government to produce guidance for their communications teams. We've worked on campaigns relating to banning conversion therapy and facilitating conversations around childhood trauma. And we've done training and inclusive communications reviews for health and national social investment organisations. But being completely frank, inclusive comms isn't always at the top priority for all of our clients, but we very much see our role as bringing those clients along with us on that journey by steering them to integrate inclusive comms into everything that they do. It's fair to say that there was somewhat of a revolution for diversity and inclusion following the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, which you'll all be familiar with. And the importance of inclusive communications is something that the world has definitely woken up to. We say most of on this slide, just as you might have seen an article in Adweek a few weeks ago about some organisations that are reversing their EDI promises. And really, it's only a handful of sort of mostly American firms, but it really does hit home, and that we are really a very long way away from where we need to be. these stats, I think, speak for themselves. So lots of people don't feel represented in advertising, but this goes up for people aged over the age of 55. People are living longer. Lots of people aren't even becoming grandparents until they're in their 70s. So what it means to be 50 plus is changing significantly. And with that, the way that people who fall into this age bracket need to be represented in comms and advertising needs to change too. And as you can see here, how disproportionately disabled people are represented in online ads compared to the British population. So while these figures do show a stark reality of how much work needs to be done, nobody is saying that it isn't a tricky space to navigate, as we're seeing with some of these companies rolling back their EDI policies. So in all of the work we've done in this space, there are two key barriers which keep coming up time and time again. It'll be interesting to see whether you recognise these within your own organisation. So it's fair to say that the woke washing movement has got a lot to answer for. There's a fear of getting it wrong. That was a top concern among the UK's top 100 marketers, and many of the brands who have reversed their EDI policies have done so due to external political and social pressure. So, for example, the agricultural manufacturer John Deere faced criticism for sponsoring a Pride Fun run, and so now they have reduced their commitment to supporting female and Black-owned suppliers. Target has faced similar criticism, but this time from LGBTQ plus groups for stocking Pride-related merchandise only in locations across America considered to be LGBTQ plus friendly. And one of the challenges brought to us personally was a UK pub chain that was facing backlash from punters for changing pub names that were considered to be inappropriate in this day and age. So names like the Midget, for example. And then on a smaller scale, when we've worked with other clients, it's come down to things like not knowing the correct words to use or worries about overrepresenting minority population groups. So the second one that we tend to get a lot is kind of this sense of inclusion for all. So by this, we mean that organisations get really, really hung up on the challenge of trying to include everyone all of the time. So for context, there are over 7,000 languages in the world, 60 different racial profiles, 72 genders, 8 socioeconomic classes, and some of these categories like gender and disability exist on a spectrum. And then there are intersectionalities. So for example, your audience might include someone who is a Black Asian boy flux with ADHD from the traveller community. So for obvious reasons, it's not possible to totally represent and at times include absolutely everyone all of the time. Side note that AI could have a role to play here, but that's for a very different event and would take a bit longer to go through. But for example, when we're creating an image or using a real life story as part of our comms, sometimes we can only feature one type of person in that communication. And sometimes we're limited by resources and availability, etc. So if I come on to an example, I suppose, of kind of where we face this, we recently launched a very powerful and triggering campaign for one of our clients about road safety. But it was under a very tight deadline and with a very limited budget. We really, really struggled to find diverse actors for the hero film. Like we just weren't getting applications through. We did make some gains with it. But one thing that we were also really concerned about is that the film itself was focused on a single parent family. This was partly for budget reasons. We were mindful of the unintended consequences of drawing parallels between, for example, a Black mother and son and the issue of road safety and irresponsible driving. So you'll most likely be familiar with the fire that Heinz is coming under at the moment for this out of home advert. But rather than getting hung up on this, what we decided to do instead was work to find other means of reaching and reflecting different audiences through our partnering influencers. So we partnered with influencers from the deaf community. We partnered with influencers who come from sort of all different racial backgrounds. So we were able to kind of, improve the diversity of the campaign in that way. Ultimately, it comes down to comms at the most basic level, which means making choices about how and what you communicate based on who is in your audience and why you're trying to reach them. But decision-making becomes much, much easier if you understand the key principles of inclusive comms and are therefore able to rationalise why you have made decisions that are sometimes difficult to make. We'll come on to these principles shortly, but for now, I will hand you over to Claire, who is going to talk you through some of the key challenges Macmillan faced in this space.
Thanks, Sheri. So like a lot of organisations that Sheri's mentioned, Macmillan have been on a really steep learning curve in the last couple of years in relation to equity, diversity and inclusion. We're also really conscious that cancer doesn't discriminate. It affects everyone, and we need to be relevant to all those people. So everyone with cancer can feel able to come to us when they need us the most. We had done a lot of work in areas. We've done a lot of work in relation to building our bank of storytellers and the diversity of our photography, as well as quite a lot of work in our marketing areas. But what we tended to do was go for what you might consider the more classic forms of communication and the ones that have the most systematic approach, like a marketing campaign to how you develop them. Lots of touch points, lots of sign-off points, lots of opportunity to kind of build in that EDI thinking. And what we really wanted to do was consider the wider breadth of our external communications. So that would include things like our press releases, the reports that we produce to share with our partners or government contacts, our social media posts, and the content we produce and share internally with our staff, so that we could take a look at our communications in the round and really consider the breadth of things we did and those areas of communications that can have very different processes to how they're developed and signed off. You'll see our challenges are similar to the most common ones that Sheri noted earlier. We know that there's a lot of positive intention within our organisation. We are really lucky about that, particularly in our communications teams, around making sure diversity and inclusivity is part of our communications, but that people weren't always sure what to prioritise or what the right approach was. As Sheri talked about that, a principle of trying to reach everyone at once, and actually that's not really going to work. So how do we make sure we're reaching everyone across the breadth of what we do? We also knew very much, as Sheri had pointed out, that people could be so concerned about getting things wrong that they might be put off doing anything at all. We know this tendency to perfectionism is not limited to equity, diversity and inclusion in a lot of cases, but that fear is exacerbated in this area, especially when it comes to language or speaking to audiences that people just have less experience of or that we haven't traditionally reached. So we knew we had a lot of work to do, and we really wanted to push ourselves to do the best in this area. But to date, we were essentially marking our own homework. And of course, we don't know what we don't know. This meant it made sense to get some outside support, someone who could look at our breadth of work and really interrogate it. We wanted them to tell us what was good so we could do more of it, of course. We knew we had some things that were going well, but we also wanted to find out where we were lacking so we could try and focus the enthusiasm we had internally and point it in the best direction. So that's why we went out to tender for this work, and that's why we ended up working with Folk. And I'm going to hand back to Sheri, who's going to tell you about how they approached the work.
So yes, Claire and her team approached us to do a review of their communications, so internal, external, etc. Now, what I would say is that projects like this can be hugely challenging and sensitive in nature. So how we get there is just as important as the outcomes and recommendations at the end. So firstly, bringing people along with us on the journey was really crucial. Macmillan, which I'm sure Claire won't mind me saying, is quite a big and complex organisation. There's lots of cross-team working. So we needed to establish project champions who are essentially a core group that were involved in the project from the beginning and who ultimately became advocates for the project through a shared sense of responsibility. It was also important to SWOT anything that might help or hinder the success of the project. So we all went into it very mindful, very demure up front about what action might be realistic for where the organisation was at the time. And then, of course, stakeholder mapping to help us identify who we needed to communicate the project to, how heavily they needed to be involved or consulted, and whether the communications might need to involve them at all. Then we did the 360-degree review itself, which consisted of interviews with the internal team, a survey to external parties, and an audit of Macmillan's materials, as well as conducting a literature review of the latest best practice on inclusive communications, just because this is a space that's evolving all of the time, and to ensure the latest best practice was reflected in any of the recommendations that we made. So then we produced a report outlining our findings and then recommendations which were grouped into areas of keep doing, stop doing, and start doing, ultimately giving Macmillan the information it needed to take action. We also tapped into our Real Folk panel. So they are a collective of comms and marketing professionals that we recruited to help our clients have access to expertise from people with a diverse range of perspectives. So they help us with workshops, they help us with training and pre-flight campaign testing. So we can do due diligence on our work, and so clients don't end up in the same position that Heinz have done recently. They supported us with the audit in this project, which we apply using a standardized framework that we've developed, but which allows them to bring their unique perspectives to the table and to help us determine where Macmillan was using best practice and where they could develop their approach. So we reviewed the interviews, the survey findings, and audit of materials in line with our 6 inclusive communications principles. So we developed these through a rigorous year-long project, through reviewing the latest literature, interviewing people at lots of different organisations. Makes it all sound quite light when I say it like that, but I cannot express to you just how much work went into developing these and getting them right. Many weekends missed, late nights and social occasions missed. Luckily, my husband still decided to marry me afterwards. But yeah, we got there in the end. I won't go into all of them in detail, but I'll take you through 2 of them. So audience relevance essentially brings us back to comms and marketing basics, and this is one of the most important principles, I think, out of all of them. So who is the audience we're speaking to, and what are we trying to achieve by speaking to them? And therefore, how does this impact how we communicate with them? So lots of organisations, Macmillan included, will have broad audiences who will be made up of many different intersectionalities of people, but there may be certain groups that need to be prioritised, either because reaching them will have the greatest impact on their objectives or because they're being underserved. Or perhaps you have a narrow audience. So for example, if you're a car insurer, your priority audience is not going to be individuals who are registered as blind and who can therefore not legally drive. So while it would be wonderful to be able to ensure everyone can access all of your comms at all times, the reality is you might need to prioritise, and of course this may influence like accessibility considerations you make and representation considerations that you make. Similarly, for an event, will you have anyone in your audience who is hard of hearing? If not, is a sign interpreter necessary? Probably not. And then just to pick out another one, representation. This one is one that a lot of clients we speak to get hung up on. So should the number of non-white people in our images be proportionate to the UK population? Or when we use an image featuring a Black person, we get called out for being tokenistic. So firstly, we just need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of representing people from a variety of demographics in our imagery? And as marketing and comms professionals, our jobs are literally about influencing people. So we have a huge role to play in how people understand and experience the world. If we just show how the world is rather than how it could be, this continues to bed in harmful stereotypes, makes people feel like they're not seen, they can't see themselves becoming parts of the organizations that are, recruiting for jobs, that sort of thing. It isn't all about visuals though either, and you can represent a person or a group of people through written or audio storytelling, or by showing that you align with them on issues that they care about, for example, supporting a charity or supporting a cause that matters to them. So there's lots of ways to represent different audiences. So let's take a look now at some of the findings. I must start by saying that when we did the audit, it was very clear that Macmillan was already doing some really great work in this space. And to Claire's credit, she actually had to keep pushing us. to be as critical as possible with the ultimate goal of striving for true best practice. We created this chart just to give a sense of Macmillan's strongest areas, for example, empathy and authenticity, and then their weakest, which was the overall consistency of their approach. We won't have time to run through all of these today, but we've picked a handful to run through with you with Clare's permission. So consistency. As I mentioned previously, this was probably the biggest challenge for Macmillan, and I think it probably is for a lot of organisations. Essentially, there was loads of great work going on, but it really was a mishmash of great in some areas and then just less so in others, and different people saw different things as priorities. It was really encouraging that lots of individuals were confident when it came to inclusive comms, but what they thought was important or that they should be doing more of depended on their individual knowledge or interest area. And really, we were just seeing a lack of clear objectives and processes that would have helped them to have a more coherent approach. So, for example, there were multiple different guides and resources, but they didn't really tie together or point to each other. And team members didn't always know that they existed or when to use them and how to use them. And while learnings around inclusive comms were sometimes shared, this didn't always happen, and learnings weren't always actioned. So the next area then was sort of simpler language. So broadly, Macmillan's use of language was clear, it was straightforward. They definitely had an awareness of inclusive language, which was present across their comms. But there was just still some more scope for it to, for some of the jargon and the technical words to be reduced, particularly in instances where it was clear that the comms needed to reach a broad audience who might be made up of people who are dyslexic or English might not be their first language. Some materials were also very, very text heavy, which similarly might have been challenging for people with language barriers or even people who have shorter attention spans, such as ADHD. And while language was broadly inclusive, there were examples of ableist language, such as stand with Macmillan, being used in campaigns. So then the next area that we looked at then was authenticity, and Macmillan's comms were genuinely authentic across the board. So this was a really, really good area for them. So external survey respondents, they praised Macmillan for the caring and compassionate tone of their communications, saying that it made them feel understood and supported. You might think, oh, it's easy for a charity to come across as being authentic and caring about the people that they're communicating to, but telling stories about people with lived experience is really central to Macmillan's strategy. And that really helps with authenticity and demonstrating that Macmillan gets its audiences. The only improvement area here was just to take it up a notch by co-creating with people with lived experiences of cancer, by involving them in the ideation and comms development process, just because this is central to making communications informed and authentic for obvious reasons. And then representation. So with regards to representation, overall, really good report with Macmillan broadly representing diverse age groups, ethnicities and experiences in communications. Women, particularly mothers, were well represented. It was just felt that more diverse perspectives and imagery would have been beneficial. So, for example, more disabled people, children, men and their health issues, and socially isolated groups. So, for example, in one piece of comms, there was a reference to kind of work, friends and family. And it was just felt that this phrasing might be overlooking people who don't work and perhaps lead more socially isolated lives. So that's a very brief look at some of the findings. We then developed 33 key recommendations, and then we grouped these into keep doing, stop doing, and start doing. But recognizing that obviously this is a lot, went into lots of detail. We helped Macmillan then to prioritize them. And I won't share all of those with you now because we'll be here all day. But I have, again, pulled out some of the ones that Macmillan have started to take forward. And then others that I think organisations could take forward themselves. So getting expectations set, and it is really important for developing consistency. So getting to a place where everyone in the organisation knows and agrees what they're aiming for and what the minimum level of knowledge that all staff should have when it comes to inclusive communications. So, for example, what are the core competencies that everyone should have when it comes to writing for accessibility? And then building on this with expert competencies that perhaps more senior or specialist comms people should have within the organisation. Here's an example just for accessibility. So you might expect everyone to have a knowledge about like font size and accessible linking, but other things like accessible video might be expected of someone more senior or specialised. Given that inclusive comms is a relatively new area for comms professionals, so having guidance and resources and knowing where to find them, when to use them, can just really help with empowering teams in this area. So for Macmillan specifically, some of our priority recommendations included streamlining the resources that they had available, making some of their guidance more practical and easier to digest, and then linking off to for people to be able to find more detailed information when they needed it. Another recommendation was about creating guidance as to when and how to work with internal teams in this space. So some larger, more complex organizations, for example, might have EDI networks or other teams who will have a vested interest in inclusive comms. So it's really important to know when and how to work with them. It's also really important to embed a supportive growth culture around inclusive communications. It's a tricky space. So the more positive reinforcement you can give, for example, by celebrating good work and building it into your internal comms program, the better. You might want to share daily writing tips. For example, did you know that screen readers can't detect the ampersand sign? Or run a screen reader challenge for World Sight Day, where you put any copy that you're working on through a screen reader to develop your team's understanding as to how screen readers interpret your writing. And then building inclusive comms into your processes is also super important. So, for example, have you incorporated inclusive comms into your crisis communication strategy and processes? The next bit then really is the academic wheel of privilege. So I just use this as an example for how people can reflect on different demographics with different levels of privilege. So it's split into different demographics. So there's body size through to education level, and the closer to the outside of the wheel you are, the more likely you are to be marginalised. In a crisis comm setting, you might want to use this to stress test different issues from different perspectives. And then finally, putting measures into place to plan inclusive communications from the very start of any project is often half the battle. So rather than getting halfway through delivery and realizing, oh, we haven't budgeted for accessibility requirements, or we need some more diverse case studies, where might we find one? Or we forgot to factor in direct mail for people who aren't computer users. Putting those plans in place up front is really important, and a planning and reflective framework can be created at a strategy, process, project or campaign level. And it just allows people to plan and review their work and document best practice and trade-offs that they've had to make. So making trade-offs when it comes to inclusive comms is often one of the most challenging things to contend with. For example, if your budget means you have to be selective with the formats that you've used. But if comms people can show that they have thought through these challenges and that perhaps some of them weren't within their control, this can just help to reinforce people's confidence and remove that fear of being blamed for not achieving inclusive excellence. So for example, when you're trying really hard to find a diverse range of influencers, but you can't find anyone who is willing or who you can afford, who's available, then at some point you need to make a decision to either continue with the activity with who you have or to drop it. And then, ask yourself, is it best to go direct to the drawing board or not? Which is going to have the greatest impact on your audience? And if you can't find the right type of influencer, how else can you balance the activity to ensure that you represent and reach different communities in different ways? So I will hand back to Claire now, who is going to give you an update on where Macmillan is in its inclusive comms journey.
Thank you. So as you can see, there was a lot of recommendations and we weren't in a position to action them all immediately. So we did have to prioritise balancing what would have an impact with what we could most realistically achieve. We were really pleased to learn about the areas we'd done well in, including the work that we'd done in recent years to improve our stories and photography, had really meant that people living with cancer felt that we were being authentic in our storytelling and what we were sharing, but also understanding there were still some spaces we could improve. So one of the things that came out, as Sheri mentioned, was that we could use more men in our stories. Did have a bit of feedback from the team that, well, we had men in cancer and that wasn't part of the audit. And we have had to do some serious self-reflection that although targeted pieces and campaigns can be really powerful, that doesn't mean you've ticked that box and you can move on and you don't have to worry about the people in that campaign being covered in other areas as well. So that's something we've really been challenging ourselves on. We had a whole range of guidance internally, as Sheri has referenced, but they didn't always speak to each other. And ironically, our accessibility guidance could be some of our least approachable documents, really chunky, really hard to get through. So we're currently working through those, simplifying what we can and better signposting what we have so that people don't feel the need to keep recreating. I think that was part of the risk, that people didn't know what was there, so they were starting from scratch every time. We also sometimes get really excited to deliver work and we don't spend enough time thinking up front. And equity, diversity and inclusion in particular can really suffer from that if we're not doing real InDesign from the beginning. We're working on this more generally as an organisation and trying to be better at really purposefully using equity by design in what we're delivering. And so that means building EDI into our core processes, such as defining our outcomes and deciding what approach is best to use. We also wanted to make it simpler for people to embrace EDI. That includes providing additional training around consistency, talking about things like alt text, as well as refining some of our policies that have maybe been a bit vague, such as our approach to translation and just being really explicit where we could be around what people should and shouldn't be doing. Probably most importantly of all, we wanted to get people comfortable with the fact that we're still learning and that's okay. That meant consciously building EDI into our learning processes and regularly auditing our work. Folk recommended at least an annual review, and actually we already review our comms and our materials on a quarterly basis. So we just built EDI much more explicitly into that process and asking more questions. We also trying to take more time celebrating what we've done well, so that we can learn from each other and really foster that growth narrative. We haven't got it all right yet, but we're working on it, and it's okay that we're still working on it as long as we keep moving in the right direction. So I'll just hand back to Sheri one last time.
Yeah, so I know we're running over a little bit, but just going to recap now, and then we can just answer some questions for those of you who've got the time. Just to recap, we talked about some of the challenges that organisations face when it comes to inclusive communications, which I expect some of you will recognise. Fear of getting it wrong and the challenge of trying to include everyone and be everything to everyone all of the time are two really big ones. We've given you some insight into the principles we use and how these can help tackle some of the decisions that need to be made when it comes to inclusive comms. We've also talked about the role that we as an agency played in helping Macmillan take a truly critical look at itself in the mirror, as a means of striving for best practice, and how we help them to validate a way forward. And we've taken you through some recommendations we made to Macmillan, which could potentially benefit your organisation. So thank you for joining us today. We do hope you found that useful. And as I said earlier, drop us a note if you'd like to catch up to discuss your challenges. We're offering sort of workshops to do that. So we'll move on to answering questions. I can only see one currently in the chat. So yeah, just get your questions in now, or if you think of any later, please don't worry and sort of send those on to us afterwards. So from Imogen, saying that you're keen to explore for your comms, internal and external, plain English training for your global team. And then just recommendations in your case for a global audience, and how best to roll it out and support all levels of staff to engage in and deliver it. I've got some thoughts. Claire, do you want me to take this, or?
I've only ever worked in UK-based organisations, so Sheri, if you have some thoughts, please.
Fine, of course. So I think it really depends on what we mean by plain English. So if we mean English as the English language, that would need a certain approach. And then if you're talking about plain language more generally, which is kind of which would be sort of in different languages, that would require a different approach as well. But I think ultimately, what you'd really want to do is potentially look at recruiting like you could either recruit a panel, like our Real Folk panel of communications experts from different places across the world. You could even recruit like an internal panel within your own organization, because you're going to have sort of a diversity of sort of different people across the organization, and sort of coming together really to kind of agree again, like what are those kind of core competencies when it comes to kind of that plain speaking. So getting that right in the first instance and kind of establishing what does plain speaking or plain English look like for the organization, building that into people's objectives. I know some organizations have sort of done, have even made sure that everybody in that organization has actually had a session on it as well. So whether that's training or kind of, one-to-ones to kind of, just to highlight that how it is everybody's responsibility. And then I think going forward, really, ensuring that it's built into your internal comms processes, and constantly reminding people of kind of ways to use that plain English, because otherwise people will forget that the guidance is there. Do we need a big budget to do this? So I think if you're talking about a sort of the project that we did with Clare, no, I wouldn't say it's a big budget. It all depends really on it all depends on what you're looking to achieve. So we get a lot of people come to us asking for training, or they want a guide, and then what we tend to do really is just interrogate like what is the actual challenge you're facing at your organization. And then we'll tailor kind of what we recommend depending on what that objective is. So yeah, we do sort of vary it a lot depending on what the organization needs and what their budgets are. So we can take the scale sort of much bigger or much smaller depending on the organization, and we do offer discounts as well for charities and organizations like that as well.
Can I build on that, Sheri?
Yeah, of course.
If the question was also leaning more widely into how to embed some of these recommendations, I think there's kind of almost two sides to it. I think there's so much organisations can be doing that doesn't really cost, and where organisations might be using cost as an excuse, there's always work we can be doing. A lot of this really comes down to people's behaviours and just thinking about EDI at the right time and making sure that we're always challenging ourselves and not just taking the easy route. And that doesn't really cost anything to think about it in a bit more depth. But then, almost to contradict myself, an organisation that's really committed to this needs to also find the money where it is needed. So to Sheri's point around casting, if you're needing to go out and do wider casting for photography, or if you're needing to go further afield and travel more to get to the right voices and all those kind of things, organisations should be willing to put the money behind it if they're taking it seriously. But also there's a lot you can do that doesn't cost a lot. So I think there is a bit of a balance to that one.
Cool. And then we've got another question then about having the best intentions but struggling to ensure achieving consistency in comms. And so how do you ensure guidance is adhered to? So I think that really comes back to similarly to the recommendations that we made to Macmillan. Making sure that any resources that you've got are easy to find, clear, succinct, point off to kind of more detailed guidance for when you need it. And I think crucially as well, building it into people's objectives, and also the kind of the planning and reflective frameworks that I talked about, because then that kind of makes you start any sort of project that you're doing thinking about the challenges around EDI that you might face, and then when you come out the other side of the project, then you fill that in, and then you take those learnings forward. So then you make sure that you're you're not making the same mistakes twice. And then that becomes quite like an open and quite an open culture around, I suppose, like sharing kind of, you know, best practice, and then also with mistakes, and not being afraid to sort of talk about those.
And I guess the principle of making sure that the organisation is really clear on what it means, what success looks like in this area, because if each area has slightly different objectives it's setting or is writing slightly different guidance, it makes it much harder. The more single voice that an organisation can be about its commitment to these things, the more likely everyone is to be able to eventually buy into it. It takes time, of course, and I agree that it's one of the hardest bits, not just in EDI, but in any guidance or recommendations that an organisation puts down, is actually, you know, getting people to do it. But I think the more at that fundamental level, you know, what your organisation is striving for in this space, the more everyone can get on board and drive together on it.
Yeah, sort of ownership as well, isn't it, Claire? I suppose, like knowing that, like, you know, you've got a team over here is doing some guidance and you've got another team over here doing other like it's kind of going like either get together or this one person or one team looks at it and leads on it. So yeah, cool. I think, is that everything? So so yeah, we haven't had any more questions through, so we'll leave it there, but we'll be sending the recording around, and if you've got any follow-up questions, please send them through to us. And if you do want to get in touch and bounce more ideas around, yeah, just email hello@thefolkgroup.com, and yeah, we can set up a workshop. But yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye.